I got Kian out there. Awesome. Always takes a little while before people jump on, but we've got a loyal following of like 8 or 9 people every Wednesday here at Mahana. So it's always nice to see our peeps pop up. Here we are again, good people. As you tune in, or if you're going to watch this later on, for our next season or next version of our Mahana Culture Chat, and really super lucky and appreciative to have our man, Dr. Stephane Shepherd. I don't know if I've ever called you Dr. Stephane Shepherd before, my friend, but anyway, it's a nice introduction. Just so people know that I'll hang out with people with doctors at the beginning of their titles. Anyway, I think you're going to find this really interesting. Hey, Tice, how are you? How are you, my man? Hey, if you've got any questions, I'll say it again. If you've got any questions, put them up like you asked last time. Tyson was awesome, and we'll get to those at the end. But before we kick off, I want to make sure that we set ourselves right as always and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're connected to. That lovely concept of where my feet are in the end connected to where yours are, and the land that we are here in Melbourne. Nam is Wurundjeri land, the people of the Kulin Nation, and just really respecting and acknowledging their understanding and richness and depth. And we had Sue and Hunter on here last time. That living memory that they hold of this land that we live, work, and play on, and really acknowledging their elders, past, present, and emerging. Some really exciting times to come as we start exploring what it is to be part of and aligned and on the lands of the oldest living culture in the world. So I really want to acknowledge them. Greg, how are you, Greg? Dr. Greg and John, lovely to have you guys here. So here we are with Stephane. We've been hanging out for 6-7 years. When was it? 2014. Yeah, Stephane. I like to tell people that we were doing this session in the city, and Stephane was locked out of the building, so he shimmied up the side of the building in Collins Street and somehow made it in, sweating and stuff. And but we met at a cultural session that we were delivering when I was in another past kind of professional life, and really instant connection, really, in terms of spirit and interest and curiosity, especially in this cultural space. And we've been hanging out ever since. My wife laughs, because she's done all the academia in our house, but somehow I ended up through Stephane being the first published research author, which is fantastic. So we did a paper together, which focused on determinants of young Pasifika people in the youth justice system, and we've been hanging out ever since, and it's personal now, as well as professional, which has been really enriching, not only for me but for Mahana. Stephane was around as that dream was coming to fruition, and really thankful for your time and energy here today, my friend. So we're gonna keep our same kind of formula, nice and simple, and wanted to kick off just by asking, what's that big brain of yours reading or watching or listening to in COVID time at the moment, my man?
No, good to be here, brother. And I was just remembering that day I got locked out of the building. I actually walked up 10 flights of stairs to be in that meeting.
Normally 20. It was 20.
But no, thanks for having me. And I too acknowledge the custodians of the land, at least where I am, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay respects to elders past and present. And just before I answer that, bro, I just want to return the compliment. As many of you would know, Tavale is a tireless, passionate and enthusiastic advocate, I think, for empowering those who are, disadvantaged, those who often don't have a platform. And he does this work very much through the way of strengthening relationships and building partnerships and coalitions in a very inclusive way. And I'm always impressed with his energy and dedication to improving the lives of people around him. So I've learned a lot from you, bro, through our friendship, and I value that very much.
Thank you, my man.
Yeah. So what am I reading? That's a good question. So I just finished reading a book called Ghetto Side by Jill Leovy, who's a journalist, and this was I highly recommend it. By the way, it's a gritty account of the neighborhood dynamics and relationships with police in an inner city urban community in Los Angeles, and so it follows the police around sort of a homicide unit, I guess, as they attempt to solve murder cases in South Central LA. And you soon realize how challenging that proposition is. The police there are very under-resourced. There's a sort of a neglect of serious violence. There's an under-policing of serious crime there. Part of that is caused by under-resourcing, as I said, but it's also caused by sort of some of the neighborhoods not wanting to cooperate with police for various reasons, and there are historical implications in that. But just the social deprivation, the gang violence, and senseless sort of retaliatory killings for young people in some horrific circumstances where, as I said, socially challenging environments where violence is normalized. It's vividly captured by the author, and there's a sense of hopelessness. It's hard to digest, but it's written very journalistically. It's entertaining despite the difficult subject matter, and I definitely recommend that book if you're into true crime. I also just started reading, this was last week, so I haven't really got into it, but that's Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, and he's a cognitive scientist, a professor at Harvard, and he's written widely on human behavior, the human condition, and linguistics. And this book argues that there's been substantial progress across a number of economic and health markers over the past 100 years. For example, a reduction of extreme poverty and sort of disease, and that Enlightenment values like sort of reason, science and humanism are important tools to continue that progress forward. So, that's sort of what I've been reading when I actually do find some time. I've been trying to catch a glimpse of the NBA playoffs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. It's been strange watching. How are you finding watching the NBA and that kind of format? It's a bit eerie, crowds and stuff, hey?
Yeah, it's bizarre. That's exactly right. With no audience around, it's sort of, I feel like I'm watching a pickup game. Sort of a competitive pickup game, and it kind of no audience dampens the atmosphere, I think. But it's interesting how some players have flourished in the bubble, and I sort of wondered whether some of them normally feel the pressure, the anxiety, and sort of without a audience, without a crowd, they might play a little better than normal with less pressure, and they're not traveling either. They're all in the same place. So I don't know whether that benefits some teams compared to others. But other than the NBA, I haven't watched really any TV during COVID.
Cool. Yeah. I was thinking as you was it Ghetto Side? Was that the name of the book?
Ghetto Side by Jill Leovy.
I just watched the Bloods and the Crips documentary on Netflix. It's really well done, actually. It's kind of I had a bit of a assumption of what it was going to be like, but they do it really, really well. Like dig deep into the historic contributors, I guess, to those things. So anyway, same neighborhood, tells a long history of I'm sure a lot of the same similar stuff in Ghetto Side. So awesome.
That book delves into the history of the Bloods and Crips as well. So there's a lot of overlap. Yeah.
Cool. Well, have a check of that, people, and Stephane, when you got some time, it's really good on Netflix. So awesome. You've got a fascinating story, my friend, both personal and professional, which is all it's been honor to share and hear about. Was hoping you could share some of your cultural tale. It's a real core to us in terms of being able to work into others, our own cultural tales. So if you could share whatever parts of yours you're cool with, that'd be awesome.
Sure, bro. So my journey. So it's taken a few twists and turns, but I'd say it's definitely overall been a fairly fortunate one and a satisfying one. There's been some ups and downs, but I'd describe it as a never-ending, lifelong pursuit for knowledge and truth, but also understanding that life's pretty complex. But it's about understanding or I suppose learning to be comfortable with that level of complexity, being comfortable with imperfection. That's something that it's taken me a few decades to understand, that life is a series of trade-offs. There are different experiences and different perspectives, and people come from different communities with different ideas. But every sort of idea and every policy decision has consequences, and it's never black and white. And again, if there's anything that I've learned through my life experiences, it's learning to be comfortable with that complexity, and not too easily finding comfort in, say, narrow-mindedness. Always being open to different perspectives, challenging myself and my views constantly, and then working together to solve problems. But it took some time to get there. So in terms of the cultural tale, I was born overseas. I have French African ancestry. I counted some, social difficulties and challenges at that time. Wound up sort of in an orphanage in a developing country as a baby. But I was fortunate enough to be adopted at 6 months old, and so I was flown over to Australia. And I grew up in Melbourne with parents who were originally from New Zealand, but they spent much of their working life in France. And so because of that, I was fortunate enough as a younger person to, spend time in Australia, spend time in New Zealand, and occasionally in France at various times. But I guess I was in a multiracial household in suburban Melbourne in the 80s, which was somewhat unusual. But it's interesting, though, because I think that multiracial composition, it didn't, although I say that now, it didn't play much of a role, I don't think, in my life. It always seemed to be a curiosity of others, that I sort of grew up with white parents, but I was ensconced in that. It was sort of business as usual for me, so I didn't think too much of it. And I still get asked that now, that dynamic must have been strange, but it wasn't. But I use it, like others, I had the, usual sort of grappling, with my identity as a young person, in their adolescence. And I encountered some hostility, ostracized at sort of various times. But, my parents were pretty focused. I'd describe them as caring disciplinarians. And so what that did is it's kind of tethered my mindset to the realization of potential, and not to get too distracted by, I'd say, negative or demeaning commentary. Now, I know that's not always possible. It wasn't always possible for me to do that. As one, particularly in those developmental years, you're quite self-conscious and inadequate, and dealing with sort of acceptance and sort of maturity. But, it was a foundation that was provided, and along with my own sort of specific personality traits, somewhat introverted, pretty focused, conscientious, and sort of structured. Somewhat, as a young person, I was a bit of a social isolate. Now that prevented me, I think, at times from derailing completely, except at susceptible moments in my life at school, as a teenager and as a younger adult. But, I got through school, and after finishing school, I went to university, but I soon realized that was a bit premature for me. I wasn't in the right mindset. So I spent, I dropped it. I didn't drop out. I sort of left it after about a year, but I spent several years doing various odd jobs. I worked in factories and security. I was a bouncer for a while. I attempted a sporting career that failed miserably. But I returned back to, university in my mid-20s, and I haven't actually left. So I'm still there 15 years later. I began with a degree in criminology, and then that followed with a master's in journalism. I think at that point in my life, I wanted to be a journalist, but it was at that awkward sort of period, 2006, 2007, where you still had the blogosphere, and we hadn't had this sort of online explosion with alternative sort of sources of media, the democratization of media online. So I was still in the blogosphere, and I was too old to get a cadetship at a newspaper. So I worked in corrections briefly, and then the opportunity to do a PhD in forensic psychology popped up at Monash. And so I invested myself into that, and, the rest is history. So now I work as an associate professor at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science at Swinburne. I was originally at Monash. And, just in terms of the discipline, so forensic psychology, it's the intersection of mental health and the law. Another way of putting it would be it's the application of psychological principles to the criminal justice system. And my research has primarily focused on, why do young people end up in our criminal justice system? What are the risk factors for violence and offending? What are the protective factors that can disengage someone from offending? What is the role that mental health might play in that interaction? But most importantly, how do these risk profiles or offending trajectories differ for people from different cultural backgrounds? And my academic career has taken me all around the world. I worked for several years in the US, even including recently. I still go regularly. And I think just to bring it back to what I was saying at the beginning around identity, so my experiences in the US have really broadened my worldview. So as an example, sort of kind of demonstrating the different places that I lived in over the journey in the US. So I've worked with different marginalized communities on the ground over there. So I lived for 1 year in the rural Midwest, which, is Trump heartland, and interacted with people there on the ground. And I saw, white rural communities, struggling. I saw family breakdown, economic destruction, opioid addiction. I also spent a lot of time on Native American reservations, and I saw, groups of, proud people living in utterly, depressed circumstances, isolated from the rest of society. And I also lived in Baltimore for almost a year, and I saw, concentrated poverty and gun violence at a level that is unimaginable. But so I guess what I took from that, one thing that I took from that, is that I learned that, hardship and tragedy and, despair and adversity knows no color. So, but what I did see was that increasingly was that a lack of, meaning and purpose is engulfing society at a concerning rate. And I think discussions of crime and solutions can't ignore that reality. But just to finish, on a personal level, living overseas did have some impact on my identity. So, for most of my teenage and early adult life, I was searching for an identity group to belong to. So sometimes it was racial or sort of ethno-cultural, national, political, and being sort of mixed race and somewhat ambiguous looking, I moved between groups quite a lot, but was always unsatisfied. I never quite fitted into any defined category. And then after spending those years in the US, I was just the Australian guy, which was somewhat liberating. And I guess I realized at that point, well, I don't need to fit into any category. I'm an individual, I'm malleable. I think for myself, I can define myself however I want to. And my identity has taken, many iterations. It's still a work in progress, but I've got to the point where I don't think it needs to be something. And this sort of links back to what I was saying about living and navigating complexity and just being at peace with that now. That was a bit long-winded, but
no, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. It's really interesting, brother, listening to speak, because I spent 10 years in California and, some pretty formative years for my late teens, early 20s. And like that season of my life, I think, just listening to your tale, had the most profound identity impact, I think, of all my seasons so far. Even up until now, it's manifested in, being part of an organization that loves to explore, supports people to explore their tales, So, I really align to that. And Stephane's of all the places that he's been, he always seems to bring up Louisiana, New Orleans. New Orleans is the place to be. Good hip hop clubs in New Orleans. So it's got some locations if you're ever looking for some there. So thank you. And as you can see, Pete's like a rich, deep tapestry of a tale, that's still evolving. And thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate it. So from that, if you could in a few words say this is what it is, what would your kind of core definition of culture be? Like what does culture mean to you?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. I'll start with a boring academic description. I'll sort of go from there. How would I describe it academically initially? So it's a set of behavioral and social norms, practices, belief systems that are shared by a group of individuals within, I guess, a defined population. It differs, from ethnicity, which implies some kind of shared ethnicity and ancestry. But I think culture is important, like personally, for a number of reasons. So culture can shape behavior, obviously. So it can sort of determine the parameters on what is expected within a particular cultural group. What is typical, what is deviant or a transgression, what is a faux pas or taboo, or how people within that culture would react to a certain transgression. It obviously impacts how we communicate. For example, how will we share our sort of distress, pain? How do we regulate our emotions? How do we frame or shape our goals and motivations? So that'd be sort of culturally induced. Also, because I work sort of in the psychological space as well, it can underpin health models, right? So do we have sort of very, I guess, narrow individualistic sort of explanations, for particular ailments, or do we have sort of more holistic, interpersonal kind of models, sort of, that sort of focus on, achieving sort of health and well-being? It can also underpin how we act, with providers. How much do we want to share with, authority or, professionals? Do we resist? Do we, mistrust particular scenarios? And also help-seeking behaviours. Who's our first point of contact if there's a problem? Do we only involve our family and community? Do we keep it in-house? So culture can have an impact in terms of, how we're interacting, how do we interpret our behaviour, what are the rules, the parameters, and I guess how systems manage and respond to that kind of, behaviour as well. And some of these issues will always require some extra attention if there are obvious distinctions between groups within a particular jurisdiction. But at the same time, I'd also say that, and you would know this, bro, as are a lot of the listeners, a lot of cultural groups are heterogeneous, and so they're diverse within. They're just as diverse within and without. And even sort of within a cultural group, say that would fit under a called category within, say, Australia, for example, you have different degrees of attachment and interest in one's own ethnic culture, and different degrees of identitarianism or acculturation, or levels of, biculturalism that changes from person to person. And for some, the ethno or racial cultural consideration for them may not be as important. For others, it'll be, extremely important. It'll be activated in many different scenarios. For some, it'll only activate in some, very specific scenarios. It'll bear little significance to some people in some situations. And as I always say, it's always wise to kind of avoid having, preconceived notions of an individual based on their supposed cultural background. But the way I would look at it, this is more sort of less arcane. This is sort of more of a personal opinion now. I like to think of culture as a personal culture. So, and if you're working with a client, I always like to get a sense of their own personal culture. And this comprises a whole range of different intersecting influences. So it could be your ethno-culture, as I just mentioned, your racial background or so on, but also your own peer group culture, your neighborhood culture, your school or employment, vocational culture, professional culture, your political or religious culture, sexual orientation, et cetera, the totality of your life experiences. So the cultural tale. And I think all of those elements interact with together. They interact together, and they can sort of more strongly predict behavior, I think, than, say, focusing narrowly on your ethno-culture, which might only be superficially held. So I always like to think of it in terms of, personal culture, because there are obviously a lot of intersecting elements within each individual.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's this, I can't remember her name, but there's this beautiful TED talk by this lady from Brooklyn. I think she's from Brooklyn. Parents originally from Nigeria, I believe, but she talks about being multi-local. That concept of being multi-local. So actually, some of the biggest determinants and shapers of us are things that we're experiencing in our day-to-day lives. The cafe up the road that we always get our coffee from. Where we work. Like that's. I think it's a important construct. Tice asked about. Australians don't have a culture, and I guess I'll jump on that one real quickly, Tice. It's what we get often, and it's a space that Mahana especially is really honoured to step into and provide a safe space for people to explore the water they swim in, because we don't often see it, because as Stephane has talked about with his upbringing with his parents, he's been swimming in that water all his life. and we often don't see that until we step out of that water, go to the States, and you know, there's cultural ceremonies and things we don't think about often as culture, like why do and how do when we have a birthday, we have this cake and we put these wax candles on it and light the number of candles, and somehow everyone knows a song. That's a cultural ceremony, you know. That's not how everyone does birthdays. And so I think, Tyson, to answer your question, you know, there's a gentle and awakening opportunity to hold a mirror up and say, yeah, you do. Let's celebrate it. Let's explore not just your ethnicity, you know, like all those strands that Stephane talked about. So I love that. I love that, brother. I love the complexity. We've been talking about that a lot of Mahana, the complexity, but not the complications of culture. And Greg talks often to that, the differentiation of those. So just to finish us off, and you know, he's a humble man, Stephane. You know, there's someone who's talking about working, you know, and traveling around the States. You know, that was on an unbelievable scholarship and academic offering that, you know, they he went on some of the most powerful, important work in the space, academic space, to be done by a man here, especially in Australia. And so I thought it'll be interesting for you to share some of the kind of key pieces, or that either that you're working on at the moment, or something you're really interested in, and just with some viewers today, you know, what's kind of really got you going at the moment? What are you deep diving into in terms of that that kind of, you know, the space that you hold with your cultural research, etc.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll focus on a couple of, like two if I can. So one of them has been sort of looking at, you know, why people are entrenched in the justice system and why there might be different trajectories for different groups. And I guess another one is, you know, working as a culturally competent clinician. So there's sort of the two areas that I've tended to focus my more sort of recent career on. But, you know, I guess I'm passionate about implementing evidence-based solutions to try and reduce offending in Australia. And I've spent a decade not just sort of conducting research in this space, but I've seen the human cost of offending firsthand. You know, I worked for a couple of years in prisons here in Victoria. I've seen the environments that young people in custody come from. I've seen the toll it takes on their families, you know, and their communities. And I'm concerned about sort of rising levels of offending among particular groups. And as I was saying, like some of my work is in the sort of culturally linguistically diverse space. And, you know, what my work has tended to find is that, you know, called youth, if I can use that, you know, fairly broad umbrella term for now, they share sort of similar risk factors for offending than, say, Anglo-Australians or, say, Indigenous Australians. So they're typically coming from, you know, unstable environments, you know, some level of social disadvantage and family breakdown. And we're also seeing, you know, mental health concerns, substance use issues, peer delinquency, and disengagement from school. However, I'd say that called young people also face additional challenges, which have led to overrepresentation for particular groups. So, for example, some have faced, you know, serious pre- and post-migration stresses, disruption to their lives, traumatic experiences, family fragmentation, limited support networks. And one commonplace factor is an obvious disunity between first and second generation, you know, seeing different speeds of acculturation within the same family unit, completely destabilizing the family unit. You know all about this, bro, with your work as well. And all of this can sometimes provide fertile ground for some of those other risk factors I mentioned before: peer delinquency, substance use, disengagement from school. Now, you add to that perceived discrimination as well. So you'll often get a sense when you speak to sort of called young people who are justice involved that they believe they're treated differently by the criminal justice system. So there's this cynicism that has developed. For some, their community reputation has been destroyed, you know, particularly from sort of media coverage has been somewhat sensationalized. And so many will carry this sense of social rejection and view mainstream relationships and institutions with hostility. So a lot of anger has been accumulated from, you know, prior and current negative interactions. add to that, being, the stigma of, for some being, low SES, or a person of color, or being refugee, visible minority, internalizing all of that. And, one can start to feel devalued. So you've got this complex mix of, post-settlement factors, family destabilization, and social rejection. It's pretty common among called young offenders. And so, and this is an ongoing problem. So when, working in the youth justice system, I know that, at least a third, possibly a half of the young people currently in custody are from called backgrounds. So, I'm really, passionate about trying to address those concerns urgently before it gets sort of more out of hand. And I should point out, this is not just a called issue. This is an issue across the board. It's just that my work focuses on called young people. But I think it's clear that we can't also arrest our way out of the problem. We can't keep turning, entrenched social problems, mental health problems, homelessness, family disunity, substance use, integration challenges, over to the police service to deal with, which they often aren't equipped to deal with. So we need a sort of a holistic reimagining of, public safety that gives us, tools beyond just coercion and detention. And we also need to develop non-punitive solutions. So where you can have police, say, working alongside the very service providers and outreach workers that can address some of the social issues, rather than the default position, which is, increasingly processing people through the system that have, all kinds of complex needs, with few other options to work with. And I think this has become increasingly more important in a dynamic, competitive, market-based, cosmopolitan society that is fast engendering this gap between those who can function well within that system, and those who don't have the tools or resources to engage with it. And I'll just, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but I'll just sort of mention the last part, which is, because as you know, bro, some of my work has worked in the cultural competence space as well. And so this is more around sort of how can we work more effectively with different groups. And I've been critical in the past of various approaches, say with sort of cultural awareness, which is, and it comes from a sort of a well-intentioned place, right? Because we've had professionals that have been ignorant of, belief systems and, worldviews and histories and norms and traditions of various clientele. And therefore, these people, when they come to service providers, will feel excluded, ignored, or discriminated against, or misunderstood, right? And therefore, they might receive sort of a compromised service. But, at the moment with the cultural awareness, you get a lot of corporate environments expected to undergo sort of those types of workshops, and the evidence for the workshops that focus very much on sort of what I call stereotypical traits, haven't been particularly effective. And I think sometimes the workshops are limited and they're implemented for cynical reasons, right? So to avoid litigation, for example, or give the impression that the organisation cares, when really there's sort of, it's a way of avoiding trying to address anything deeper. So it becomes it's sort of window dressing. So I'm unsurprised that some of those sort of approaches that are really about perpetrating stereotypes aren't too effective. So what I've tended to focus on, and I think this aligns very much with sort of Mahana's outlook too, is that it really should be very much around a relational sort of aspect, very much around rapport development and flexibility. So relational is sort of not necessarily focusing on specific sort of cultural, traits that we would sort of, again, apply to an entire cultural group. Having worked with young offenders, I found that, one of the number one issues that particularly from called backgrounds have when describing a disinclination to work with mainstream services is that they feel that there hasn't been rapport development or a strong enough investment in developing a sort of a level of trust and relationship building and camaraderie. So that's where I think it's important: relationship building, trust, and I think that's paramount. That needs to happen first. So what we assume in a sort of a short assessment, clinical assessment, that a person who's carrying a lot of baggage or not used to opening up will suddenly divulge, personal, shameful, humiliating information, particularly with someone they don't perceive to be interested. So this takes time, developing those healthy relationships with a trusted, respected source. It's not always necessarily being about, if you're from the same cultural background or understanding an obscure artifact. It's about developing that connection, possessing a verbal communication style that's sort of warm, being calm, avoiding superior or condescending tones, not being patronizing, not being immediately intrusive, because as you would know, called, particularly collectivist cultures, are very much focused on that sort of social interdependence with others, and these groups are much more sensitive to the sort of social and non-verbal cues. So for me, this really heightens the importance of being relational, non-judgmental, open-minded, flexible, being keenly aware that our behavior can easily induce feelings of social rejection. So my whole mantra has been around developing those close and supportive relationships that are
awesome.
relational, not transactional.
Yeah, no, I love it. It was really topical. We're currently doing a course with a wonderful youth service team from a local government, and we were just having this conversation with them yesterday that working with young people, and especially in their region, highly multicultural, diverse region, but those relational. The importance of that relational work that they do, but the limitations that are, or not necessarily limitations, but also the lens that's put on the time it takes to build those relational isn't always embedded institutionally into their roles, into their work. We're doing some stuff with child protection practitioners. They are part of their role is task, get the assessment done, and wanting to build that relationship, but often not having that embedded into it. So I think it's some really important. It's such an important piece of work and point that you bring up. That how can we continue to move that into the institutional framework? So sometimes it's time for task. And from an individualistic lens, that's often the default. Let's get to the meeting on time and bring the agenda and get into it. From a collectivist, the meeting is it's the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting are the ones you want to be at. So such important knowledge, and just so necessary to keep building that evidence base, that research base. So the likes of ourselves and all these other wonderful people who are doing amazing work in their communities can build off that, and say, see, this is it in a academic research framework, and that it connects. Man, that's been amazing. I hope you guys have connected with and been enriched by just some of the sharings of Stephane today. Just thank you so much for your time, my man. Always appreciated. I know Stephane's about to have to move out of his house in the next little while. He's doing renovations, so he's a trooper. Finding a quiet space as we have to in these times to do that. So anyway, my friend, it's always appreciated, and the work you're doing is so important for all of us, especially the cohorts that you focus on. So really appreciate your time today.
No, thanks again, brother, for having me. And again, keep up the good work. You're doing a fantastic job. So good to see you.
Cool. Thank you, all beautiful people. Often we see the same people showing up, and always nice to see others. But you are appreciated. Choosing us on a Wednesday afternoon, getting to hear from amazing brothers like Stephane. So thank you all. Take care. Peace out, and we'll catch you up next time.